Hey everybody, my name is Elizabeth with World's Cup of Joe. Awaken your soul. Welcome to our Soul Love Through Literature mini-series on the classic novel, The Great Gatsby. We are on episode 3 of our 4-part mini-series exploring the twin flame connection between Gatsby and Daisy in The Great Gatsby. Last week, Gatsby, after 5 years, finally got to see Daisy again. Nick arranged the meeting between Gatsby and Daisy, and emotions, energy, and feelings were extremely heightened at the beginning of their reunion. We find out that Gatsby wanted Nick to arrange the meeting at his small cottage in order for him to be able to show Daisy his mansion, which was walking distance away from Nick's home. Gatsby had worked for the past 5 years to be able to make money and come back to Daisy as an accomplished, prominent, and wealthy man. Something he was lacking and conscious of when they were together all those years ago. And he had an urge and desire to impress her with this persona now. After the energy had settled down, Daisy and Gatsby seemed to pick up where they had left off all those years ago. They were so absorbed in each other's energy that Nick became invisible to both. In today's episode, Gatsby and Daisy continue to get closer, and Tom, Daisy's husband, also becomes aware of their feelings for each other. Today's episode starts off at Gatsby's house, and 3 people on horseback ride up to his home. One of the individuals is Tom, Daisy's husband. Gatsby recognizes Tom immediately, as any push would know their perceived threat, but Tom doesn't recognize Gatsby right away. First quote. Moved by an irresistible impulse, Gatsby turned to Tom, who had accepted the introduction as a stranger. I believe we've met somewhere before, Mr. Buchanan. I know your wife, continued Gatsby, almost aggressively. That's so. Tom turned to me. Tom goes to Gatsby's mansion because his friends know Gatsby. He seems taken aback when Gatsby aggressively comments that he knows his wife. Feel the tension and the energy of this exchange. Gatsby, as the push polarity, must be going crazy being in front of Tom, his direct competition. So much so that he doesn't hesitate to basically throw his hat in the ring and make it known that he is competing for Daisy. Jealousy is a very common feeling for push polarities. Our addictive energy makes us not able to think rationally at times or often when we are in the midst of a trigger, and no doubt Tom's mere presence triggered Gatsby. Next quote, Please don't hurry, Gatsby urged them. He had control of himself now, and he wanted to see more of Tom. Why don't you stay for supper? Notice what it says. Gatsby had control of himself now. Was he able to get out of mind and back to presence? Or was he just able to calm the trigger down enough to stay around Tom longer? I have the sense that Gatsby wanted Tom around in more intimate settings in order to assess him properly and observe his flaws. There's nothing the push polarity loves more than to know we can handle any karmic or soulmate that is blocking our path to our person. Being able to observe and assess is almost a way to soothe the addictive energy, but it is definitely still mind. The following week, Gatsby holds another party, and this time Daisy goes and is accompanied by her jealous husband. Gatsby managed to get under Tom's skin enough that he wouldn't allow Daisy to attend the party without him. But Tom being with her at the party didn't stop her from making her feelings towards Gatsby known by engaging in behaviors that she felt must be kept hidden from Tom. Daisy and Gatsby danced. Then they sauntered over to my house and sat on the steps for half an hour, while at her request, I remained watchfully in the garden. When they left Nick's home and returned to the mansion and parted ways, that was the end of Daisy's good time at the party. Next quote. I knew that except for the half hour she'd been alone with Gatsby, she wasn't having a good time. Daisy was enraptured in her soul's presence. She was drawn to Gatsby, and that was the only thing she could think of, so much so that she even found herself succumbing to stories from the mind. Her glance left me and sought the lighted top of the steps. After all, in the very casualness of Gatsby's party, there were romantic possibilities totally absent from her world. What was it up there in the song that seemed to be calling her back inside? What would happen now in the dim, incalculable hours? Perhaps some unbelievable guest would arrive, a person infinitely rare and to be marveled at, some authentically radiant young girl who, with one fresh glance at Gatsby, one moment of magical encounter, would blot out those 5 years of unwavering devotion. It's interesting to read this and put yourself in the negative polarity's mind frame. She is at Gatsby's house. He's throwing an outlandish party where celebrities, trendy couples, and young, beautiful women are all attending. Gatsby has morphed into a celebrity of sorts among this crowd, and he is handsome and rich and well-known. To Daisy, he holds so much charm and appeal, and she is creating the story in her mind that some young, beautiful woman can come along and steal his attention. But notice how oblivious she is to his devotion. One moment of magical encounter would blot out those 5 years of unwavering devotion. How negligent she is of the fact that his unwavering devotion is just that, unwavering. She has no idea of the depths of his emotions towards her, which is extremely true for the negative polarities. They know they love us, but they are asleep, so their feelings can be turned off and on based on the energy. While the positive polarities' emotions are always unconditional, almost obsessive love, it is just that, unwavering. But unknown to Daisy, Gatsby has not stopped, not even for one moment, obsessing about Daisy. After the party is over, he goes over to Nick and says, "She didn't like it," he said immediately. "Of course she did." "She didn't like it," he insisted. "She didn't have a good time." He was silent, and I guessed at his unutterable depression. "I feel far away from her," he said. Put yourself in Gatsby's shoes. His sole purpose of owning the mansion and throwing extravagant parties was to impress Daisy. That was it. He didn't do it for the excitement, the people who came, or any other reason, except to hope and entice Daisy into coming over one Saturday night. When she didn't, that is why he went through the extra effort to meet and acquaint himself with Nick and have the third party introduction instead. Daisy, finally attending one of his parties, didn't enjoy herself. Gatsby was clearly distressed by Daisy's reaction to his party. Nick commented that he saw his unutterable depression. Now look at what Gatsby says next. "I feel far away from her." I can feel myself tingle from this quote. He just saw her a short time ago. The only enjoyable time Daisy had that evening was in his presence, and yet Gatsby feels far from her. I can relate all too well to this feeling. My person, during my addictive energy and before separation, lived with me, and when he was downstairs in the same home, I felt far away from him. The mind only sees separation, and it is an extremely intense and painful feeling. I remember to get my person's attention, despite being less than 200 feet away from him in the same home, I would post on social media how lonely I was and make it a personal attack on him to make him feel bad. The push energy was so very destructive. I sense the same loneliness and separation from Gatsby after Daisy leaves, and I feel for him. He wanted nothing less of Daisy than that she should go to Tom and say, "I never loved you." After she had obliterated 4 years with that sentence, they could decide upon the more practical measures to be taken. One of them was that, after she was free, they would go back to Louisville and be married, just as if it were 5 years ago. There is so much expectation and preference in this passage that it tells me Gatsby is completely in mind. One thing I know for certain, if Gatsby needs Daisy to tell Tom for him to feel better, she won't. The expectation of need is one of the worst energies for this connection. It completely pushes the negative polarity, and they will never do what their twin needs for them to do. This next quote is telling of where their connection is at, that he has the ability to push and for her to pull. "And she doesn't understand," he said. "She used to be able to understand. We'd sit for hours." He broke off. "I'm going to fix everything just the way it was before," he said, nodding determinedly. "She'll see." There's an air of desperation in Gatsby's words. It shows that the bubble phase is over. He cannot talk to her the way he used to. When the bubble phase ends, the connection can only be run through soul, no more mind. If they used to be able to sit for hours and talk like soulmates, it is because mind energies weren't yet a repellent to Daisy. But now Gatsby was in mind and wanting Daisy to leave her husband, and he looked at her refusal as her just not understanding him like she used to, when it is his energy she can't adhere to in that moment. After that evening, there's a change that happens at Gatsby's home. Nick finds out that almost every servant has been let go, and there's no longer parties taking place on the weekends. Nick doesn't understand what's going on and thinks that Gatsby may be sick. I hear you fired all your servants. I wanted somebody who wouldn't gossip. Daisy comes over quite often in the afternoons. So the whole caravanserai had fallen in like a card house at the disapproval in her eyes. Nick deduces that Gatsby had only thrown the parties for Daisy, and when she disapproved, he shut them down. This also shows that Daisy and Gatsby have been growing closer over the last weeks, with her coming in secret to his home during the afternoons. Nick gets invited by Gatsby to go over to Daisy's home the next day and agrees despite feeling that something is going on. Gatsby will also be there attending, and when they arrive, it is Tom that greets them both at the door. Mr. Gatsby, he put out his broad, flat hand with well-concealed dislike. I'm glad to see you, sir. Nick. Make us a cold drink, cried Daisy. As he left the room again, she got up and went over to Gatsby and pulled his face down, kissing him on the mouth. You know I love you, she murmured. Gatsby and Daisy are not scared to be together in front of Tom, nor are they hiding their feelings in front of Nick and Daisy's friend Jordan. She doesn't even try to hide her feelings in front of Tom. Look at the exchange that takes place with Tom back in the room. Their eyes met, and they stared together at each other, alone in space. With an effort, she glanced down at the table. She had told him that she loved him, and Tom Buchanan saw. He was astounded. His mouth opened a little, and he looked at Gatsby and then back at Daisy, as if he had just recognized her as someone he knew a long time ago. This quote is important for a few reasons. One is that Daisy is okay with her emotions and feelings for Gatsby on display. The other is for what was going on in Tom's head. He had just recognized her as someone he knew a long time ago. This shows that her love for Gatsby sparked something within her that he was never able to reproduce. Remember, when he met Daisy, she was coming off her heartbreak with Gatsby after he left for the military. He saw in her the same love she must have felt when he first met her. Something that as time passed had diminished or in his mind had died, and now has been revived through Gatsby. To change the awkward setting and tension that is now in the room, Daisy suggests that they all go to town. She tells Tom to bring some alcohol, and he leaves the room to retrieve it. While he is gone, here is a conversation that occurs between Gatsby and Nick. Gatsby turned to me rigidly. I can't say anything in his house, old sport. She's got an indiscreet voice, I remarked. It's full of... I hesitated. Her voice is full of money, he said suddenly. That was it. I never understood it before, but it was full of money. That was the inexhaustible charm that rose and fell in it, the jingle of it, the symbols, song of it. High in a white palace, the king's daughter, the golden girl. This passage is a huge insight into why Gatsby never felt like he measured up around Daisy. His lifelong pursuit of gaining wealth was to equal out to Daisy in how her mere presence sang of money. Imagine a poor kid trying to be acceptable to the king's daughter, the golden girl, and understand where his pressure mounted from in trying to always prove his worthiness to her. The parties, the mansion, the cars, the money all stemmed from this insecurity of her being wealthy and every bit of her being showing her worth. When leaving the house to head to town, Tom tries to demand that Daisy drives with him, but she tells him, "You take Nick and Jordan, we'll follow you in the coupe." She walked close to Gatsby, touching his coat with her hand. We will conclude episode 3 with the 5 of them leaving and heading to the city. Daisy has shunned her husband for Gatsby and seemingly has no shame in doing so. They are at the height of their love affair, and she is okay with flaunting it in front of her friend, her cousin, and her husband. I hope you join us again next week for the conclusion of The Great Gatsby, a great twin flame novel.